Chapter 13, Gladiator Days. My next cellie was an individual by the name of Joey Fernandez from Visalia. Almost from the beginning, I really didn't care for the guy. It wasn't my choice to move him in. He came in from the 2-yard and my cell had an open bunk, so I got stuck with him. I tried to tolerate him for the first couple of days, but there were certain things I saw about his habits and mannerisms that I couldn't bring myself to see past. Dude was filthy, he had oozing acne that was repulsive, and there was a feminine nature about him that annoyed me in the worst way. Things eventually got so bad between us that I completely stopped talking to him, and it became real awkward in the cell. One day, Joey jumped up and said he was going to tell the floor officer that he wanted to move when he came around to pass out lunches. I didn't have a problem with this at all. I didn't respond, but when he started writing something out on a small piece of paper to hand to the CO, I said I wanted to screen it first. He was acting funny, so I wanted to make sure he wasn't writing something about me. He took offense to this and tried pumping his chest out, telling me that he didn't have to listen to me. I told him he wasn't sticking anything through the door unless I saw it first, and if he tried, I'd smash him. When the tier officer came to the door with lunch, Joey rushed to the door, said he needed to talk to the sergeant, that it was urgent and they couldn't wait. They cuffed him up and took him out. 20 minutes later, the tier officer came back with the plastic bag and told me, "What did you do to that guy? He doesn't want to come back." I just laughed. It didn't surprise me. I knew this guy was a coward. The CO told me to pack up his property and then they moved him to the next section over. Later, I found out that he got himself written up for refusing to come back to the cell. As a result, they took his yard for the next 10 days. Unfortunately for him, the timing couldn't have been worse because things were about to get real interesting on the yard, and he ended up putting himself in a position that was irredeemable. A couple days later, Chente moved in with me. I didn't want to take a chance of getting stuck with another riffraff, especially after the last two. On our next yard, one of the gunners told us that our yard was going to be integrated with the Sureños' yard and we were all going to come out together. He also told us that the Bloods and Crips were also going to be put out on the yard together. This sounded so ridiculous that nobody actually took him seriously and we all thought he was joking. How could the administration put rival gang members on the same yard? There's no fucking way they would agree to something like that. As unseemly as it may sound, they actually did agree to it. The administration combined our yards for no other purpose than to stage fights and encourage bloodshed. There was no other logical explanation for it, especially in light of the fact that they were well aware that we were enemies and would unquestionably fight. On the following yard, Chente and I were the first ones out, followed by Jasper and Chino. Jasper told us that when the Sureños came out, he and Chino were going to talk to them and try to come to some type of agreement to where we split the yard and designate a line in the middle that could not be crossed. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He was actually going to propose an agreement with the opposition. Programming on a yard in a whole setting with Sureños was a clear violation, and everybody knew it. This violated the 7th bond, but there was nothing I could do but adhere to whatever policies Jasper implemented since he was the one holding the security position. If things went badly, he'd be the one held accountable, and he would surely have to answer for it later. I couldn't understand why he put himself in this type of compromising position. Why not engage as soon as they came out? I offered to rush the first Sureño that came out through the gate because I wasn't comfortable with the decision Jasper was making, but my hands were tied. All I could do was wait and see how it all played out. As the Sureños came out to the yard, they began to congregate in the opposite corner of the yard until the last 2 were brought out. There were about 10 of them and 8 of us. When they were all in the corner, I watched them as they wrapped socks around their hands. I told Chente, we should just rush these fools, bro. In my opinion, the fact that they were wrapping their hands with socks should have been considered an act of aggression and was reason enough to engage, but Jasper just told us to wait. We had no choice. We had to wait. After they finished talking, Jasper and Chino told the rest of us that they agreed to split the yard and we'd exercise on our own two sides. They would have their security post up on their perimeter and we would have ours post up on our perimeter. I was half tempted to completely disregard what Jasper agreed to, but didn't want to get myself in a wreck either. I probably would have been justified if I had rushed them, but at the time, I wasn't seasoned enough to know. Nothing happened that day, but when Chente and I returned to our cell, I told him that it looked like some of the sureños were plotting and sizing us up. A few days later, when we went out to the yard, I approached Jasper again and adamantly expressed my concerns about being on the yard with sureños under the auspices of an agreement. I tried pointing out to him that it violated bond number 7 and we could all face repercussions for working with the enemy or what others might perceive as cowardly dealings. Jasper's ego got the best of him and he took this as a personal attack on his integrity as the OA, or as if I was questioning his ability to make sound decisions. At the very least, I wanted to make it completely clear that I wasn't on board with what he was doing and strongly opposed to being a part of any of his agreement. At that point, there was nothing else I could say or do, but I felt I at least covered myself. Chente and I were housed in C-section at the east end of the building, so we were the first ones to get pulled out to the yard and the first ones to go back in. When the COs returned at the end of our yard to run us back in, they called us first as they always did. At the time, all the sureños were squatting down, lined up against the fence in the corner of the yard by the small enclosure that led back into the building. When we approached this small area, all the sureños began to stand up as if they were getting ready to go in. This in itself should have raised a red flag. We should have been more security conscious about them sticking together in one spot, but everybody was distracted and nobody caught it. As I approached the enclosure with Chente directly behind me, I looked at all the sureños as I walked by and then entered the enclosure and got ready to strip out. Just then, some commotion caught my eye. I looked over to see Chente getting rushed by 3 sureños. I torpedoed out the gate and started bombing on as many as I could before the gunner started shooting. I dropped the first one as soon as I came out, but when I started fighting with the second one, I took a shot square in the back with the 35mm block gun, aka Big Bertha. I didn't really feel it at the time because my adrenaline was pumping so hard, but the sergeant had another 35mm block gun stuck through the fence within 5 feet of us, and this time I took another shot to the left side of my rib cage. This one temporarily knocked the wind out of me, but I didn't stop fighting until the sureños started getting on the ground first. By this time, the gunner on the catwalk had already grabbed the Mini 14 and chambered a round, so everybody got down on the ground. Honestly, I wasn't even mad at Jasper, despite the fact that he was solely responsible for putting us in this situation. I think I was more relieved that we were no longer going to be honoring this agreement and no longer on the same yard with these dudes. I remember actually laughing when we were all on the ground and telling these sureños, "It's on now. You little pussies want to rush my boy when he has his back turned." Jasper, Chino, Paco, and another homeboy by the name of Anthony Troubles Alba from Salinas were on the back of the yard and didn't have a chance to get involved. They were basically caught sleeping. Chente, Sleepy, and I were the only ones who got off, so they brought us off the yard first and put us in the holding cages. They also put 2 sureños in separate holding cages, the one I knocked out and the one who got his eyes split open by Sleepy. Everybody else was brought back in at one time and escorted back to their cells. As Jasper and Chino were walking by, Jasper called out to me, "Hey Box, my bad brother, I should have listened to you." I replied, "Don't worry about it, it's all good. I'm gonna smash these fools now." Me, Chente, Sleepy, and the other 2 sureños were written up for mutual combat and then placed back in our cells. I didn't know it until the next day, but one of them fools actually hit me in the eye. I had a fucking black eye. They kept the yard on a 10-day lockdown anytime an incident occurred out there. A couple days later, they pulled us out to hear our 115's rule violations report. and told us that if we pled guilty, they would take 90 days good time and let us back out in time to go to the next yard. They were encouraging us and wanted us to go back out. Our only real interest was getting back out to the yard as soon as we could, so we pled guilty and took the time. Since Chante and I were always the first ones to go out to the yard, we were the only ones who ever got a chance to engage with the sureños the entire time this whole ordeal was going on. This became routine. We'd get up early in the morning, go out, fight, plead guilty, and then make it back out in time for the next yard. It also became a routine for the COs too. Every morning on our yard days, I'd watch the sergeant and the yard gunner get their 35mm block guns ready, go outside and get themselves in position before they started running us out. The sergeant would have his gun cocked and stuck through the fence. Sometimes he'd start shooting as soon as the gate opened up, before we even started throwing blows with the sureños. The COs that worked in ADSEG were laid back, cool cats. They liked us. They come to our door and ask us, which one of the Southsider cells do you guys want to go out with today? We give them a cell number and they go and get them. We used to pick different ones all the time or go after the ones with big mouths. We knew that the COs weren't the ones staging these fights. It was the administration, so we never held this against them. But they still enjoyed it nonetheless. Who wouldn't? It was a 2-on-2 bare-knuckle cage fight, and they were placing bets. As the officers escorted us to the yard, they tell us, "We got our money on you guys," so it wasn't a secret. Honestly, there were only 2 sureños that even tried to put up a good fight. The other ones weren't even worthy opponents. Me and Chente were laying them out within the first 30 seconds, and we never lost. These guys would rush in with their heads down, swinging their arms like they were swimming. It was always over real quick. I always tried to make it a habit of maneuvering myself to face the gunners so I could watch them at the same time and would know when they were getting ready to shoot. In this ADSEG, they didn't allow us to wear shoes. We were only allowed to wear shower shoes. So we just come out barefoot without socks. Otherwise, we slip around and couldn't get any traction. Sometimes they let out sureños first, but either way, it was always no more than 2-on-2. They kept it fair. When we got inside that small closure and they'd remove the cuffs, the CO working the gate would grab a hold of the pull bar that releases the latch on the gate and declare, "Let the games begin." Then we torpedo out, start fighting, get shot, come back in, plead guilty, and get ready for the next yard. After 2 months of this, my body began to feel the effects, not so much from fighting, but from all the shots I took from the block guns. From the gunner on the catwalk, at about 20 feet above, it left huge welts and dark purple bruises, but from the sergeant, only 5 feet away, those shots broke skin and drew blood on top of the bruises. At one point, the gunner actually came to my cell and warned me about not getting down on the ground fast enough and said that somebody was going to end up getting killed out there on the yard. He said, "Mendoza, you guys need to get down on the ground when I tell you to, because you're taking some serious headshots when these guys are down, and once that happens, I have to use lethal force." The gunner was cool. I knew him from the 3-yard, and it was fair to say that he was only doing his job. So I told him, "Hey, you got to do what you got to do, man. It ain't personal. Administration are the ones allowing this to go on. So if somebody gets killed out there, it's on them." Throughout this whole ordeal, I felt bad for the Bloods because there were only 2 of them versus about 30 Crips. Even though the Bloods got swarmed on and beat up every time they go out, they still kept going. I always gave them their props for this and held them in high regard. Eventually, the administration began charging us $14.95 every time they had to fire a canister from a 35mm block gun and $28.95 every time they fired the Mini 14. This was ridiculous. I had to write home and tell my family to stop sending me money because they fired at least 3 canisters every yard, and the delinquent charges that started adding up on my account were becoming outrageous. One day when Chente and I were brought out to the yard, Jasper started banging on his window and told me that Joey was getting cuffed up and might be coming out to the yard with us. I asked him what he wanted us to do. He said let him come out and assist us with the sureños. We had previously discussed what to do with Joey if he ever came out, and we were going to hit him, but Jasper wanted to utilize him instead. When he finally came out, I told Joey to post up with us on the gate and to get off with us when the Sureños came out. For whatever reason, a Sureño by the name of Espinoza came out by himself that day. This poor guy got it bad. The three of us rushed him as soon as he came through the gate. He took all headshots. I thought there was a chance we could actually pick up a DA referral for this one since we broke his jaw and both his eyes were swollen shut. It seemed like the gunner gave us extra time that day too, but when he chambered a round in the Mini 14, we all got on the ground. A second before we got ready to lie down, I turned on Joey and socked him one time in the jaw, knocking him to the ground. It was a haymaker, a full swinging punch. Joey knew I was the one who hit him, but honestly thought it was an accident. This turned out to be a good thing because it only meant that he'd still be willing to come back out and we'd get another shot at him. Unfortunately, Espinoza was the last Sureño to come out. After about 3 months of staged fights, somebody at the top finally stepped in and pulled the plug. The yards were segregated back to their original forms and my gladiator days had finally ended. In retrospect, it was fun while it lasted, but there were times when I really thought I might be the one to get killed out there. Soon after the yards were segregated back to the way they originally were, Jasper got transferred out to Corcoran Shoe. A few days later, a homeboy from my neighborhood by the name of Federico Arevalo and another homeboy out of San Jose by the name of Gilbert Gibby Garcia came into ADSEG and moved next door to me and Chente. Both of these guys were NR members. Although Federico was from my neighborhood, we'd never met. He was a few years older than me and had been an NR member since the early 80s. I quickly brought him up to speed with all the latest issues and the current events that had been taking place there. Soon, he took over Jasper's position as the OA. When we discussed Joey and how it should be handled, Federico didn't hesitate to decide that he should be hit on the following yard. I ultimately volunteered to be the one to do it. I still didn't like Joey and wanted to be the one to take him out. That night, me and Chente stayed up late making a piece out of white styrofoam cups. Once we melted them down and rolled them onto a stock, the entire piece of plastic measured no more than 5 inches long, about the size of my palm. This weapon wasn't intended to be a killing instrument. It was more or less just a weapon to draw blood and to remove someone with head, neck, and face shots. At least the first two had to be good ones because these were only 2 or 3 hitter quitters. It usually broke after the first couple of hits. Using a rough spot on the floor, we filed a diamond-shaped point on the tip and wrapped it in plastic. Chente agreed to keister it, secrete it in his rectum, and then remove it once we got out to the yard. When they began releasing yard the following day, my adrenaline was jacked up again. I had that same feeling in the pit of my stomach the day we all went into the chow hall. This would be my first time stabbing someone in this type of small, restricted environment. Again, this was directly under the gun. By now, I was well aware of how quick the gunner was to shoot and had plenty of experience from being on the wrong side of it. I also knew I would definitely get caught. The chances of getting away with something like this on such a small yard were thin. But I wasn't really worried about the consequences or catching more time. That was never an issue with me. I was more worried about getting hit with the Mini 14. If we engaged in mutual combat, they used a 35mm block gun to break up the fight. But if they saw someone getting attacked with a weapon, their policy was shoot to kill on the first shot. I had to be real careful and try to catch the gunner while he was distracted. In situations like this, it's all about timing, navigating and finessing the element of surprise. You've got to be calculated and develop a keen ability to be completely in tune with all your senses. When we got on the yard, Federico pulled me aside and told me I could take flight on Joey when I was ready. But first, he wanted to run a full 7-on-7 machine, group exercise consisting of 7 burpees and 7 calisthenics. To take Joey's win, and thereafter, it was on me. Chente had already jumped in the shower and dropped the piece, removed it from his rectum. He had it unwrapped and in position to hand it off when I was ready to grab it. After we finished exercising, I picked up the piece and got into position in order to watch the gunner and advance on Joey when the opportunity presented itself. Joey was squatting down talking to Federico and Gibby. He was in a perfect position by the toilet, making it easy to stab him and dispose of the weapon. The next time Federico made eye contact with me, I gave him a quick nod to let him know I was ready and about to hit him. The gunner was temporarily distracted with the other yard, so this was my chance. As I walked towards Joey with the piece wrapped in a towel, I took one more look up at the gunner before I plunged the first shot deep into the side of his neck. He was caught completely off guard. Meanwhile, the gunner heard the commotion and got one shot off with the 35mm before he grabbed the Mini 14. He obviously saw me stabbing Joey, but by then it was already too late. I hit him 4 more quick times in the neck, head, and face before I flushed the weapon and laid on the ground. Joey stumbled into an empty corner of the yard and squatted down by himself. It was over that fast. He didn't really say anything. I think he was so shocked he got hit that he didn't know what to say. Joey just kept shaking his head, wiping the blood out of his eyes, which came from a puncture wound on his forehead. It took about 5 minutes before they finally pulled Joey off the yard. I remember lying there, looking over at the only tangible thing left behind, a pool of blood centered where he was squatting. That was all that was left of him. His career with us was over. That was the harsh, stinging reality of it. He put himself in a precarious position, and this was his repercussion. For me, this was an accomplishment. I felt that same raw sense of power I did every time I inflicted violence on someone from my people. Without a weapon or a statement from Joey, they didn't have a case. Once again, I eluded another DA referral. I didn't care about the shoe term because it was basically ineffectual due to my already having been validated. The only thing they could do now was take more good time. Federico and Gibby both ended up paroling in February of 1992, and Chente was transferred out to Corcoran. Over the next couple of months, they started bringing in a lot of Norteños from Fresno and assigning them to our yard. By now, the division with Fresno was becoming deeply rooted throughout the entire prison system. In some prisons, Fresno had completely separated itself from the Norteño collective. In other prisons, we were actually removing them from the main lines and engaging in a full-fledged war with them. They had become cancerous under their own accord and could no longer be allowed to coexist amongst us. We ultimately decided they'd no longer be welcome on our yard either. However, not all Norteños from Fresno were affiliating themselves with the Bulldogs, so we had to approach them individually and weed out the ones who we knew to be running with the Fresno car. If they weren't running with them on the yards, then we gave them the benefit of the doubt and evaluated them individually. Unfortunately, none of those that came through fit the bill. As the first couple trickled out to the yard, we took turns hitting them with weapons. We were literally taking turns and squabbling over who would get the next one. We were like a pack of crazed piranhas, all trying to get a bite of the meat that was being tossed our way. As they came out to the yard, we pulled them aside and briefly walked them through an interrogation before making a final decision on whether or not to remove them. When directly asked if they were Bulldogs or if they associated with them, none of them would ever admit their loyalty, and all claimed to be just non-affiliated Norteños. But we had enough resources on all the yards to cross-reference how some of these guys functioned out there, so we already had somewhat of an idea beforehand. It was only after we'd hit them that their true colors would show. Once laid out on the concrete and leaking from several puncture wounds, they start barking, a hallmark symbolization of the Fresno Bulldogs. Soon, word would spread to all the yards that we were hitting them in the hole. They weren't even attempting to come out anymore. They would lock it up and pass on yard time when offered. The next couple of months were relatively uneventful and quiet after the incidents with Fresno. We had done so much dirt on the yard that they stopped putting new people out there with us. As a result, we were no longer getting written up, and I actually got some of my good time credits back, which almost put me out the door. In May 1992, I unexpectedly found out that my date had been kicked up from April 1993 to June of 1992. I was given 9 months back and now had less than a month before I paroled. My days in Susie's house were finally numbered. I had fun while there, and my first bit in prison taught me a lot, but I was prepared to hit the streets and I was ready to take my new vision with me.